Good morning. Well, my name is Travis Matheny, and my family's been going to church here for almost 2 years now, and I've got to meet many of you, and some are still not entirely familiar, but I do want to introduce my family since we're a unit. This is my wife, Lori. We've been married for almost 23 years, and next to her is my daughter, Madeline. She's a sophomore in college. And Clara is my youngest daughter. She runs the video for our stream here at 1111, so we're super proud of her. She's a freshman. I say she's a freshman in high school, and so, did I say that? Yeah. If you can't tell, I'm a little nervous to be doing this. Even though I've given more sermons than I could possibly count in my lifetime, this is the first time I've ever preached in a setting where there's this freedom to sort of say anything regarding religion or spirituality. And that kind of transparency is still quite new to me in a church setting. But I'm excited and also a little anxious to see how this goes. But thank you for letting me be here. Since my family is relatively new to 1111 and Methodism in general, and since this is my first and, depending on how this goes, quite possibly my last time to speak here, I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit of my story. In 1972, my parents boarded a plane to East Africa to become missionaries, and they didn't know it at the time, but they were pregnant with me. And having no money to come home, and of course having a mission to accomplish, they stayed. And I was born in the downtown hospital of Nairobi, Kenya. They returned to Africa to pastor a small church in Mississippi when I was a toddler, and eventually migrated to a church in Arlington, Texas, when I was in second grade. Church has always been the family business for Matheny's. My grandfather was a pastor and a missionary when the Pentecostal movement was booming in the 50s and 60s. He started churches all over the southern United States, and even now, if I'm in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana, there's people who will know my last name because of him. My grandmother was a missionary to Africa into her late 80s. They had 5 children, and all of them at some point were in ministry, including my dad, who's been in ministry pretty much his whole life. Growing up a pastor's and missionary's kid, I thought was really fun, and I took to the family business very well. I remember I gave my first sermon at age 10 when I preached in children's church. In fact, a few weeks prior to my preaching debut, my dad had caught me using a bad word that I had heard from some kid on our street, and so he sat me down and went through all the bad words that I shouldn't say. Now, not being adept in theology at age 10, I opted to preach from life experience. So my first sermon consisted of me of writing all of these bad words my dad taught me on a chalkboard and telling the kids not to say any of these words. Now, I really felt the Spirit moving that day, but my dad apparently had some conflict to deal with after I was done. Lori and I were married in 1996, and shortly thereafter, we became youth pastors. That started a run of 19 years where I was in ministry for full or part-time. Tack onto that 18 years of being a preacher's kid, and you've got 37 years of full-time church. And no one should have to endure that much church. I figure 25 years is plenty enough to earn your way into heaven. You should be allowed to retire to maybe just Christmas or Easter at some point. But yet here I am, a member of a Methodist church and even preaching on a Sunday morning. So I either love punishment or 1111 is truly a special place, and I think it's the latter. In his best-selling book, Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell hypothesizes that in order to achieve world-class expertise in a skill, you must spend at least 10,000 hours practicing that skill. So I feel like I've earned my 10,000 hours in the skill of going to church. 37 years as a professional churchgoer helped me become a professional church actor. Actor is really just making someone believe something that you're not. Acting is making people feel that you feel something that maybe you don't. And if your life's work is pastoring at a church where you have serious theological differences, you're eventually going to have to do some acting, and not the good kind. This kind of acting is hard on the soul. I shouldn't speak for other ministers, but it seems to me at some point you either surrender to be an actor in the play, or you end up causing a lot of trouble, or eventually the conflict eats at you until you just quit. And I tried all 3 of these at some point. Let me give you an example of some of the conflict that played out for me. Our oldest daughter, Madeline, was born 3.5 months early for reasons unknown to our doctors. They told us she had a 50-50 chance to live. She spent 10 weeks in the neonatal ICU right here at Cook's Children. She received countless treatments and even heart surgery. The church where we were pastors at the time believed in prayer, and hundreds of people prayed for her. She not only lived, but she has been a picture of health ever since, a miracle. But yet there were other babies who didn't get miracles. I remember one of the first times I got to hold Madeline was just after I had seen another baby die. And I remember seeing through the glass into the other room as they unplugged the cables and wrapped it in a blanket and took pictures. And I remember thinking that could be my daughter. And eventually I would wonder if God is all powerful, why did this baby die? Is it because my baby had so many prayers and this baby didn't? Is that the way God really works? And if so, is that a God worth worshiping? I should probably say this is sort of the bummer part of the sermon. So I'm hoping it gets better from here. We'll see. But, if the answer to the question of why did my daughter live was as simple as science and medicine and skilled physicians, then that might take God out of the equation altogether. And I may have been on a journey of questions, but I was no atheist, or at least I didn't want to be. Let me tell you why at the time I thought being an atheist was so horrible. My wife and I went to the same Baptist school from elementary right through high school. That's where we met and fell in love her senior year. But it's safe to say a good portion of what we experienced there was almost brainwashing. At our school, the word atheist was a dirty word. Charles Darwin was a puppet of Satan. The founding fathers were all born-again Christians, and science was a much lesser subject than the Bible. I even remember a time where we walked the neighborhood around our school so that we could practice our door-to-door witnessing as a part of a grade for Bible class. Yes, witnessing as a high school grade is super weird. This is why questioning your worldview can be a difficult journey when the foundations are built so strong and so long ago. And traversing these waters as an evangelical pastor seemed all but impossible. For me, it got to a place where I couldn't really handle the moments where I stood on stage and tried to navigate a very narrow path between being dishonest with myself and saying something that would certainly be construed as heresy. And I think that's why I really appreciate Tom, because he just goes straight for the heresy. And that makes it easier on me today. After nearly a decade of pastoring, I resigned from the church staff. I accepted a position as the executive director for my parents' ministry to Africa, and I started a multimedia company. This was a welcome change for me because not nearly as many people were looking to me for answers. It allowed me to become more comfortable living the questions. Our church experience eventually became a house church where a handful of families would gather to eat and discuss God. All questions and perspectives were welcome, and it was a judgment-free zone. I didn't know it when we started this house church, but it would become for me a season of deconstructing God. I also had no clue that deconstructing God would be so difficult. And I can tell you a little bit as to why. I don't really remember learning that God was omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. It was just baked into growing up in church. Kind of like not being remembering learning to run. It was just part of the human experience. You never questioned if learning to run was good or true, and you didn't question the attributes of God. Somehow they just seemed self-evident. But life experiences, big and small, managed to chip away at my understanding of God. Was God all-powerful? I wasn't entirely sure if that's what the Bible said, but I was sure my experience and intellect wouldn't let me believe in that kind of power. It seemed to me that real power looked more like forgiving someone than smiting them. Jesus might have even agreed with my assessment, but Old Testament God seemed to like the smiting. Was God everywhere all the time? I felt like the answer to an omnipresent God was equal parts yes and no, which means the answer is no. Sometimes God is just not here. Unless, of course, God could also be defined as suffering. But I was brought to believe that the New Testament God wanted to bless me, not make me suffer. I thought that if God was omnipresent and has never changed, then the Bible should have explained how and why God got a makeover between the Old and New Testaments. Was God all-knowing? Maybe God knows everything that's already happened, but I couldn't believe that God knew what happened next. That's our choice. And taking that away from us takes away our humanity. And if you take away our humanity, then maybe God is irrelevant anyway. It turns out that most questions of theology and philosophy seem to lead to the same path where we question the very nature of God or whether or not there is a God at all. About the same time that we were neck-deep deconstructing God in our house church, I resigned from my position with my parents' ministry, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't required to be a Christian. That was an incredible feeling for me. So I decided I would see what it was like to not be a Christian for a while. And why not? I wasn't sure if I understood what the idea of Christ was, let alone believe in it. Jesus seemed cool, but maybe I had so much conflicting information about who Jesus was that I didn't really know who he was. Plus, I figured that if God was real and worthy of all I was told he was, he couldn't be intimidated or threatened by my looking for him in a different place anyway. So I opened the doors. I studied the Tao Te Ching where it says, "The sage is good to those who are good. He is also good to those who are not good. That is the virtue of good." I considered and learned from the Buddha who said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." And of course, I have for years followed one of our greatest philosophers, Bono, thank you, who said, "One love, one blood, one life with each other." My journey was liberating, and I learned a lot about the world. Mostly I learned a lot about myself, but at some point I began to recognize something slightly troubling. I was still looking for the answers as if the answers could be found. I was unhappy with the truth I had grown up with, so I went looking for a better truth. I was conditioned to believe in belief. The central conflict with the quest for certainty is that maybe there is no certainty. Maybe there aren't answers. Maybe there's just adventure. One of my favorite Father John Misty songs ends with the line, "I hate to say it, but each other's all we got." And ironically, the each other's all we got part is the idea that made the life and message of Jesus interesting to me again. The central message that we see from Jesus was about the kingdom. John Bright wrote, "Had we to give the Bible a title, we might with justice call it the book of the coming kingdom of God." The idea of a coming kingdom is perhaps the major theme of Jesus' message. Tom likes to refer to it as the kingdom, and I think that's the best way to understand it. Of course, the disciples had a hard time grasping what Jesus meant when he talked about the kingdom because, for starters, he generally spoke about it in parables, but also because they lived in the shadow of the Roman Empire. We can see Jesus trying to help their confusion from the reading we had this morning from the Gospel of Thomas, when they were asking him where it is, and he's trying to tell them it's not here and it's not there, and he eventually says, "The kingdom of the Father is spread out over the earth, and the people do not see it." I think people still don't see it some, and I wonder if it's because Jesus' message surrounding the kingdom was something altogether different. His kingdom message was a radical political statement, an inspired social experiment, and an alternative to everything the Roman Empire represented. The kingdom would be an affront to classism. It would be an affront to racism and patriarchy. It would be an affront to violence, even redemptive violence. This wasn't a kingdom where the king would be a man, which would have blown the minds of the Romans. The king wouldn't be the God of the Old Testament, which would have blown the minds of the Jews. The kingdom wouldn't even be about correct beliefs regarding Jesus or the Bible, which is still blowing minds of fundamentals today the way it did mine. The king of this kingdom is love, and all are welcome. In this idea of kingdom, it doesn't matter my past, my orientation, my income, my hopes, my fears, or even my correct beliefs. I am invited to be a part. You are invited too. We are all invited into one another. Maybe Father John had it right when he said each other's all we got, but I might add that maybe each other is enough. I turned 46 last month, and over the past few years, I found myself kind of sad on my birthday. I think it has something to do with measuring myself, trying to see how far I've come, to see how much I've learned. My birthday is 2 days after the new year, so it compounds this idea of seeing how much I've improved, if at all. But in reflecting on this recently, I've come around to the idea that maybe too much focus on self-improvement can morph into self-obsession. Maybe being improvement is a higher calling than self-improvement. And not just my individual being, but the collective being. The being of my neighbor. The being of the earth. The being of the generations that will come behind me. The being of one another. Being with a capital B. Let me leave you with a quote from Jordan Peterson. Faith is not at all the will to believe things that you know perfectly well to be false. Faith is not the childish belief in magic. That is ignorance or even willful blindness. It is instead the realization that the tragic irrationalities of life must be counterbalanced by an equal irrational commitment to the essential goodness of being. I think maybe my birthday doesn't have to be more than to mean that we have a moment to celebrate that I'm still on the journey, that I can still show love to others, that I can renew my commitment to the essential goodness of being, that I can learn to love the skies I'm under. And maybe that is what 1111 is about too. I love the freedom we have here to live the questions. I love that I can be me and you can be you. I love that we can celebrate love together. I love that I'm welcome here. Maybe this is what the kingdom is all about. Thank you.